Hello, welcome to chapter 23, and this is about the pulmonary um, continuation, part 2. So we first looked at the typical structures of the respiratory system, and now we're going to go on to look at the functioning of these structures of the respiratory system. So just some of the terms here: pulmonary ventilation, gas exchange, gas transport, systemic gas exchange. Um, so gas exchange in the alveoli, that's between the atmosphere and the blood. Systemic, that's between the blood and the fluids around the cell, around the blood, around the capillaries, the systemic cells. Gas transport, of course, moving the gases through the blood, moving oxygen and carbon dioxide through the blood. Ventilation is movement of gases in and out of the blood, basically. Um, a few other things: net movement of respiratory gases. So air with oxygen in it gets into the lungs, goes all the way down to the alveoli that we learned about. Diffuses into the pulmonary capillaries through the membrane, the alveolar membrane. And then that oxygen that gets into the capillaries in the blood gets carried to the systemic cells, diffuses from the capillaries, something we've learned already, diffuses from the capillaries into the interstitial fluid into the systemic cells. Carbon dioxide comes out of those systemic cells because they're the waste product of those cells, into the interstitial fluid, into the capillaries, and of course, into the blood. Then they get carried to the lungs where they are um, diffused out of the lungs into the air inside the alveoli. So oxygen in, carbon dioxide out in the lungs, oxygen out, carbon dioxide in the systemic capillaries. So here we go. That's just the same thing that I was just talking about in graphic form. So here's the lungs. Carbon dioxide goes from the systemic cells to the lungs where it gets expelled, diffused into the air and breathed out, ventilated out. Oxygen is ventilated into the blood and given to the cells. So pulmonary ventilation, we're talking about breathing. So pulmonary lungs, some air in and out of the lungs. Inspiration, air in, expiration, air out. Two phases. Inspiration or inhalation, expiration or exhalation. There's what we call quiet breathing, and this is our breathing at rest while we're just quietly relaxed. And then forced breathing during vigorous exercise or just something else that requires us to use more energy, use more um, movement of the body and such. Skeletal muscles especially need more uh, uh, gas, need more oxygen, and need to get rid of more carbon dioxide at that time. Air moves down its pressure gradient, enters the lung during inspiration, exits during expiration, which we will look at in a minute. Mechanics of breathing. It might seem very obvious when you look at it. Um, muscles of breathing, skeletal muscles of breathing. They're all skeletal muscles, but they do have the ability, I'm sure we all realize, during times of unconsciousness and sleeping, they have the ability to be taken over in an autonomic sense as well. So the diaphragm, external intercostals are for inspiration, forced inspiration. Okay, well, both inspiration and expiration. Diaphragm flattens when it contracts. External intercostals elevate the ribs. Okay, so when it flattens and contracts, that increases the space inside the thoracic cavity. The ribs are angled downward so that when they're lifted up by the intercostals, elevated ribs, that increases the volume inside the thoracic cavity as well. So this increase in volume pulls air into the lungs. We already kind of looked at that already because it also helps with blood circulation. It helps to pull venous blood into the thoracic cavity, which of course the end of the vena cava and the heart is there. So forced inspiration, sternocleidomastoid scaling. So there are other ones for deep inspiration that we don't use in a more relaxed sense or quiet breathing sense for deeper breaths. Relaxing is all we do to exhale, expire in breathing. So we only um, contract muscles during inspiration in quiet breathing. Okay, so we rely on the diaphragm, which is kind of a dome shaped. It flattens, increases the space above it. We rely on it when we relax it to spring back upward and decrease the volume in the thoracic cage. Same thing with the ribs to the side. They elevate to increase volume inside the thoracic cavity, and then they lower to decrease when the muscles relax. So relaxed breathing only uses muscle contraction during inspiration. But when we have to expel the air, expire the air with more force during things like that, coughing, speaking actually, uh, breathing, exerting ourselves, there are muscles that we use for that as well. So muscles for that are right there. Here we go. Skeletal muscles of breathing, interior, quiet breathing, again, diaphragm, external intercostals, forced inspiration, sternocleidomastoid scaleoins, forced expiration, the muscles there. Kind of went over this, look at these muscles. So the mechanics of breathing, as I was just talking about what happens to the thoracic cavity, basically inward breathing increases the volume. Expiring decreases the volume in the thoracic cavity. And it's all about volume. We'll see in a minute why volume, because the volume, the pressure changes that occur because of volume changes. The pressure is what really moves the air in and out, but that occurs because of the volume changes that we do. So again, we're looking at the dimension changes. So, inspiration, the diaphragm, which is normally a just dome shape, flattens. Still a little dome shape there, but lateral changes you can see here, and then raising up and lowering of the rib cage. Mostly has to do with Boyle's law. So here we go with volume and pressure. At constant temperature, pressure of a gas decreases if volume of the container increases, and vice versa. So pressure and volume are inversely related. So as the pressure gets higher, the volume gets lower, the constant pressure, okay, constant temperature. So if we change the volume, that something is in, expand it. Okay, the same amount of air has to sit in that space now, and so the pressure's less inside that space. Okay, so that's what we're doing when we breathe in. We're expanding the thoracic cavity, and that lowers the pressure inside of there. This lower pressure creates a pressure gradient, and so the air wants to equilibrate itself, and so it will rush into the lungs. All right, because the pressure's lower in there, the air will rush into the lungs. Vice versa, when we relax, we've compressed the thoracic cavity. All right, this increases the pressure inside the lungs, and so the air wants to go out. So this all has to do a lot with other things too: atmospheric pressure, alveolar volume, intrapulmonary pressure. So it's several pressures throughout the respiratory system. So it's through the dead space, the anatomic space, right? And it's also in and out of the respiratory space. So that where the gases are being exchanged, active respiration is occurring. That would be in the alveoli. Remember, they're like little balls, all kind of lumped together, and there's a little space along inside that ball where the air goes in and out of that space. So the air has to go in and out of that space in order for the true respiration to occur. So that's the intrapulmonary pressure, pressure in the alveoli. Intrapleural pressure, that's inside the pleural cavity. So the cavity, the thoracic cavity, pleural cavity specifically around the lungs, which of course is inside the thoracic cavity. So the intrapulmonary pressure, remember when we looked at the structure of the alveoli, and there were those little bubbles, right? They have a certain elasticity to them, so that helps them to expand and contract. So it's not just the increases in the pressures around them that makes the volume go up and down and the air will move in and out. There's a certain contractility to them, elasticity to contractility to them, where they're allowed to stretch and then return to their original shape or space. So there's always this pressure on these alveoli to pull inward, to kind of pull inward, okay? And so if they were to satisfy that pulling inward completely, you'd have a collapsed lung. That's what a collapsed lung is, okay? So then we talk about the alveoli now. If they give into that pressure to completely de-stretch, okay, completely shrink down, that's a collapsed lung. So in order to avoid that happening, there's always a little bit lower pressure inside the pleural cavity. All right, it's always a little bit lower inside that than inside the lung, inside the alveoli. Okay, because it's counteracting that stretchiness. Okay, so we've got a video here. Hopefully it plays. Oops, let me see here. Oh, there it is. Last time I will speak through it though. So when expiration ends, barometric pressure, in other words, pressure of the air outside the lungs and inside the alveoli are equal. So no air moves in or out of the lungs. So when we inspire, the thoracic volume increases. Okay, so increases. This pulls out, stretches out that alveoli, all the alveoli. It's just showing you one, but remember there's millions of them in each. So increased volume, and now it says pressure in the alveoli decreases. So decreased pressure, and it's less than barometric or the atmospheric barometric pressure. So this makes the air flow in, follows its gradient. At the end, the expansion stops, and so the airflow stops. They become equal again. So air doesn't move in or out. In expiration, volume decreases, diaphragm relaxes, and the thorax and lungs recoil. So in other words, the recoiling, the thorax returns to its original state. The lungs recoil because of the stretch that you just gave them, and the diaphragm relaxes so it springs back to its original shape. So this causes a decrease in the volume, but an increase in the volume, or increase in the pressure. With higher pressure, it follows the pressure gradient and the air flows out. And then once they're equal again, you're back to where you started. Okay. So again, the mechanical events acquired inspiration. This is just a diagram of the same kind of thing we were just looking at. So this is volume changes in the lungs, over time. So there's basically one breath in and out. Breath in, breath out. Okay, inspiration, blue, expiration, pink. Okay, now you can see here we're talking about intrapulmonary versus intrapleural. Okay, pulmonary versus intrapleural. So we're talking about inside the lungs versus outside the lungs. Okay, intrapleural is outside the lungs. It's inside the pleura. The pleura is the cavity that contains the lungs, and intrapulmonary is inside. You can see how it lags behind the pressure, so the pressure has to change around it first before it'll respond. The lung responds. So forced breathing, again, significant changes in the volume occur of the chest. Okay. How is all this controlled in the nervous sense, from the respiratory sense, nervously? The respiratory center of the brainstem consists of the medulla oblongata, medullary respiratory center in two places in the medulla, and then the pons has a spot too. So basically, it's in the brainstem is what we're looking at. Brainstem neurons influence respiratory muscles. So the brainstem coordinates that breathing. Okay, we do have, of course, you understand we have the ability to control it consciously, but if we don't pay any attention to it, we don't devote any cerebral action to it, it happens anyway based on the actions of the brain stem, the medulla oblongata, and the pons especially. So the brain stem. How does it know how to change? How does that? It uses receptors throughout the respiratory and circulatory system. So central chemoreceptors, these central, because we're talking about in the central nervous system, monitors the cerebrospinal fluid pH. So the pH changes with carbon dioxide levels. And the carbon dioxide levels, of course, change with the ventilation of the lungs. So the CSF pH changes are caused by changes in blood, partial pressure carbon dioxide. How much carbon dioxide is there in there? And then peripheral chemoreceptors look at H plus in the blood. Okay, so it looks at H plus, concentration of H plus, pH, concentrations of carbon dioxide, okay, which are directly related to H plus. So H plus goes up, all right, as CO2 goes up. I'll show you that in a minute. And then the peripheral chemoreceptors, again, they look for H plus pH changes. So looking here at the respiratory center, checking out the cerebrospinal fluid for carbon dioxide levels, checking out carotid bodies, okay, for acidity, blood pH levels, okay. And the other thing that we mentioned in there is oxygen. Of course, oxygen is a big deal too. But in reality, the body doesn't spend most of its time regulating breathing because of oxygen levels. It's not trying to get more oxygen. It just does by, an innate amounts of oxygen. What the body's trying to do most of the time is to regulate carbon dioxide and the pH of the blood. Okay. By regulating that, it regulates oxygen along with it. But it can respond to oxygen deprivation. All right, so how does it, how does it respond? Chemoreceptors, and then the respiratory centers in the brainstem, as we're talking about, ventilation decreases if chemoreceptors detect decreases in H plus or PCO2. Okay. Increased ventilation expels more carbon dioxide, returning conditions to normal. Okay. Blood carbon dioxide levels are the number one thing that really affects how we breathe, how we regulate our breathing, the depth of the breaths and the rate of the breaths. Raising that causes a doubling by 5 millimeters of mercury, causes a doubling of breathing rate. All right. what happens? Carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid in the cerebrospinal fluid. And so that change in pH is very sensitive. The nervous system, they're of course being bathed, being perfused by the cerebrospinal fluid, so they know when something changes, and so they respond at the brainstem level. Um, Oxygen levels are not really that sensitive of it. Arterial oxygen has to decrease quite a bit from 95 to 60 to have a major effect. So normally it's 95 millimeters of mercury in the arteries. Okay, it has to drop all the way to 60 before it has a major effect on the breathing. Okay. Um, so a hypoxic drive of breathing, instead of carbon dioxide, it's the oxygen levels that drive breathing, and that's called hypoxic drive or hypoxic breathing. The idea there is to try to change oxygen levels. Most of the time when we breathe, we're trying to change carbon dioxide levels, not oxygen levels. Um, so altering breathing through other receptors, joint and muscle proprioceptors. So other things that the body uses to alter breathing, to regulate breathing. Baroreceptors in smooth muscle initiate inhalation reflex, something called the Herring-Brewer reflex. This keeps the lungs from being overinflated. The lungs could be overinflated, and instead it shuts it down as a reflex action. Things for irritants, reflex, coughing. Okay. Um, Temperature of the body, hypothalamus, to try to change breathing rate if the body's too warm. Limbic system, so emotions. Frontal lobe controls those patterns as well. So again, there's other things that can affect our breathing besides just those levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide and um, H plus, acid. Here they are: sneeze, coughing, uh, preventing overinflation, hypothalamus, trying to cool the body if it's warm, limbic system responding to emotions, and even just as we talked before, as I mentioned before, a sort of takeover of skeletal muscle. Because remember, breathing is done by skeletal muscle, so it is controlled by the conscious level of the frontal lobe ultimately. Um, it also includes breathing also is also affected by some smooth muscles, glands, mucous membranes, other kinds of glands and hormones, um, smooth muscles in the bronchi, all right, in the respiratory system. Um, so again, we mentioned this once before, though, looking at airflow, change in pressure versus resistance. So something to think about when we're looking at all this. We talked about it in pressure. Another factor in airflow is resistance. Okay. Where of course when there's resistance, that's a resisting the flow of the air, right? So higher resistance is going to reduce the flow, right? So they're inversely related. Resistance higher, flow lower. What can cause resistance? Um, Maybe changing elasticity, chest walls, and lungs. Okay, so it may be that the thing that causes the pressure changes. Um, Also, alveoli collapsing or otherwise losing their um, properties that help it to exchange air, surfactant, things that affect surfactant, presence of fluids like pneumonia, elasticity of chest walls, and changing the diameter of the bronchiole. Remember, the air passageway. If that changes, less air is going to get through there. Okay, so less air can ventilate. Talking a little bit about alveolar collapsing, this has to do with what we call compliance, ease with which the lungs and chest wall expand. So that elasticity, basically, or compliance. Elasticity is its ability to stretch. Okay. Compliance is its ability to stretch and then return to the shape that it was in. Okay. So it's kind of both of those. And changes in compliance are going to change the resistance and change the flow. Um, so the whole thing, we call it ventilation. Pulmonary ventilation, alveolar ventilation. I think I mentioned that a little bit ago. Pulmonary ventilation is air going in and out of the lungs basically into the respiratory system itself. Okay, all the way through the dead zone, the carrier zone. Okay, and then alveolar ventilation is that last bit where the air is going in and out of those tissues where the actual exchange takes place. Okay, and this gets into all of those volumes and capacities that we talked about in lab. So check that out in lab and check out a video I made, and there's actually a new, um, yeah. So check out everything from the lab and the video I made about that. So, and we got what we call tidal volume. So that's just how much air you breathe in relaxed state. Okay. And respiration rate, how fast you're breathing in. This is the pulmonary ventilation rate. So remember, the conducting zone, dead space, where gases don't exchange, equals, look, it says there about 150 milliliters. So there's only so much compression that can be done of the lungs in expiration. And of course, remember the airways down to the bronchi, larynx, trachea. They are all kept open constantly with cartilage rings, cartilage structures. Um, so we got what we call the anatomic dead space. Again, this is in the conducting zone. Physiologic dead space. This is kind of like I was saying before, like in the alveoli and the gas exchange tissues that don't completely collapse. So there's that volume, that space as well. It's called physiologic dead space. All right, so I'm going to end the video here, and then there's one more part that I want to talk to you about the gas exchange process.